Hello, everyone. This is Parker Bovée from the A Show, that being an E with an acute accent. Today is the start of a new focus slash, I suppose, series in a way within this podcast series. Really going to be focusing on the food and agriculture industry with a specific subset on food and beverage manufacturing, and even within that, an even more specified and granular topic area being ingredients, not necessarily the manufacturing of ingredients specifically. I would say it's a larger focus on ingredients generally, including ideation, genetic alteration, improvements, enhancements, breeding, but a focus on ingredients and maybe exploring ingredients that previously haven't been super publicized or explored in a way that is substantive in terms of their current standing in food and beverage, but also just looking at high potential ingredients for improving not only nutritional quality of the foods we consume today, but also solving a lot of issues within the clean tech space and in regards to taste profiles of, say, plant-based proteins and plant-based meats. Especially today's instance is a great example, which will focus on getting and moving closer, plant-based seafood closer to kind of the actual tastes of plant-based seafoods. And there's going to be a couple areas of focus there. But this series is going to be entitled broadly The Ingredients Arms Race. And the specific ingredient we're going to be focusing on today with a couple subsectors within that, and to be delineated out in the coming minutes, but is going to be algae, or I'll say this once for the Brits and others listening, is algae, but algae as Americans know it to be today, and it's going to be an interesting endeavor, this episode, for a couple reasons, but one of them being at least the American conception of what algae is, and that being wildly inaccurate to what the actual realities of algae as a broad categorization of organisms and multicellular, single cellular, a wide array of what algae is. So part of that will be kind of dispelling some maybe preconceived notions of what algae is, but really trying to clarify and kind of follow along with the broader guideline of what the purpose of this podcast is, and the idea that we can bring forth a proliferation of knowledge in terms of environmentally beneficial technologies and ingredients and resources to really move closer towards sustainable practice and more holistically defined way of being in regards to caring for the planet and improving the gradual arc of sustainability, securing the futures for generations to come. Kind of a really pretty way to spell out, I guess, the underlying rationale for having this as a podcast. But that is the idea, to accelerate a transition towards more sustainable practices. And that's not always a technological bent. Sometimes it is literally just agricultural practices and no technologies involved, but something like the Three Sisters model out of northeastern America with the use of I can't remember exactly what, I believe it's corn, beans, and I can't remember the third crop, but taking potentially low technology solutions and just creating more sustainable practices. That's the idea. So moving away from a general soapbox moment there, and towards kind of what we're going to discuss here. So to run down the structure very quickly, it's going to start off with kind of defining a problem that we have today. And it's not going to be just focused on improving the taste and seafood qualities of plant-based seafood. That's going to be a large focus, but I guess kind of the other part of that is finding uses for algae as an ingredient in our food sources today. And algae is going to kind of branch out in terms of future episodes, including kind of algae as a use in biofuel, algae perhaps as a use in pharmaceuticals, which kind of ties into this ingredients arms race discussion, but algae as a use in fertilizers. So there's a lot of applications here, most of which I would say are in the probably energy and power and food and beverage space. Not all, but a lot. So yeah, we kind of have two problems here. One is that plant-based seafood is not, all that great, I would say, in a consumer bent. It really lacks the actual taste of seafood oftentimes. And there haven't really been a ton of explored solutions that have really corrected that problem. So some of the really interesting progress in the space has come out of the algae industry, even though I'm not sure you could really make the claim that it is a full-blown industry at this point, but rapidly ascending to that point. So that's kind of what we're doing. And the other part is kind of the second half of that is now that we have an idea, and there's some, really substantive scientific papers that have come out about this, that seafood, and that have broken down, we'll get to these, but seafood has been broken down into, or algae has been broken down into which components directly translate into plant-based seafood potentially. Finding ways to kind of broaden the horizon and find more uses for algae as it kind of becomes more accepted, especially in the food and beverage space. So moving on from that, the solution space is really going to talk about algae as kind of a super ingredient, not necessarily a superfood, although it does fill that as well. I actually had some today as spirulina, which is based from or I believe it's actually a cyanobacteria, but under the algae group, let's say. We'll get into definitions later. But a super ingredient and something that is often absent of taste or very limited in taste with a couple off notes to address, that can be incorporated in things and really heighten the nutritional and protein content, and just general nutritional profile. So really trying to identify the solution of algae is going to be the focus of that solution section. Then we're going to move on to a short definitions period where I kind of break down what exactly algae is and the subdelineations within that. Before moving on to the viable technical solutions we see, this is going to be kind of a more scientific breakdown of the solutions part, where we really dive into some of the key players in the algae space, both at a somewhat of a company level, but more so at a ingredient level, talking about the specific strains we're dealing with, or I guess species we're dealing with is a better term. Before finally concluding with the commercial outlook, really trying to look at who's doing what, when, where, and why. What are kind of some of the impediments to growth in this sector or partnership in this sector, and then looking at kind of the policy side, what is needed, what is going on, and what are some of the issues on the government regulation side. And after that, the general wrap up, kind of the key takeaways, nothing out of the ordinary. So going to go ahead and dive right in with that kind of set up now, and really start tackling this ingredients arms race of kind of trying to find the most optimal solutions to a myriad of problems within the food industry, but this one being really specifically tailored towards plant-based seafood. So go ahead and join me on that, and we'll go ahead and kick that off. So trying to identify what the problem is here. Plant-based seafood doesn't have necessarily problems that are distinctly unique in terms of manufacturing, I would say, to plant-based, beefs and chickens and porks. There's often actually a little bit of overlap between the taste issues in pork and seafood. So it's not necessarily a universal issue, or it's not necessarily a specific issue to seafood. All of the plant-based meat categories do struggle with issues of texture and taste and replicating cookability or cooking features, smell, appearance. But the specific conundrum that plant-based seafood does have to overcome is that it's very unique in its taste. A lot of the scientific research in plant-based meat analogs has really kind of catered towards beef in the early days, but not really been a struggle to expand pretty rapidly into the poultry and the pork space. From those, especially in the mince category, that being extrusion, technology we covered earlier in the podcast series, but a pretty staple technology that isn't super replicable in plant-based seafood. There are some applications of extrusion for sure. But looking at kind of that topic as a whole, or that industry as a whole, the plant-based seafood, there's going to be certain technologies that are a lot more viable, and there's going to be a bigger need for the layering of perhaps 3D printed or spun meats. So it's just a different category as a whole, and I think actually kind of a discussion we had in the plant-based, I think it was the B2B-ization of plant-based proteins, is that whole cuts are kind of on their way up now with the rise of, spinning technologies and layering and 3D printing. And that really does bode well for plant-based seafood. So on kind of the horizon, there is a greater impact of new technologies within plant-based seafood that could lead to a very rapid expansion if done correctly. But the issue there being, again, going back to taste profile, the seafood taste, what we're going to reference often as an umami taste, but also kind of that taste of the sea. It's the two are uniquely separate, but very related in terms of the broader taste of seafood and what you're kind of going for. It's just not replicable in almost any plant. So there's been an intense kind of research drive to kind of discover compounds or ingredients that could replicate that, and that's kind of where we find ourselves today in this algae discussion. So that's kind of one of the problems. The second problem is much more of an environmentally centered, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking here because I'd love to spend that really focusing on the ingredient side, but and covering this in a separate episode. But what we're going to kind of also just touch on now is that the general increasing protein demand by 2050, somewhere between a 50 to 100% increase in protein demand, has to come from diversified sources. This isn't anything new. I covered this in some detail in the B2B of plant-based protein video or podcast. And the kind of other piece of this is that you can expand factory farms. There's no real threat to that. But in the seafood space, factory farming and the fish farms haven't really proven as successful in generating healthy catches isn't the right word, but healthy fish. There's been many issues in terms of the salmon being of lower quality, lower shelf life, kind of off colors that have to be dyed oftentimes, and a lot of kind of curiosity surrounding the actual nutritional benefit of some of those foods. There's also kind of just a surprising amount of questions around decreasing fish stocks and a lack of clarity there just because of how difficult that is to study. And one kind of thing to point out here, I'd love to do an episode on this, but I don't really think there's enough data, unfortunately, is just the focus on fish stock research and that there's not necessarily been a proliferation of that. It's definitely grown in terms of which areas are very well monitored, but entire sections of, say, the coast of Africa are just not monitored whatsoever. Entire sections of the Indian Ocean just not monitored whatsoever. Whatsoever is maybe not quite the right word for that, but just not well managed or researched. So there's a very incomplete picture currently in terms of fish stock research. One thing we do know is that there is a level of depletion going on, but it's highly controversial in terms of how much that is. And research that comes out is often subjected to pretty intense disagreement between fish farms or not fish farms, but fisheries and fishermen and the fishing industry generally, as well as the scientists who did that. And there's also been a number of discredited studies that have come out. One that claimed that fish stocks would be depleted by 2048 without substantive reform. And there has been substantive reform, but the study was pretty largely condemned as inaccurate and using kind of just one statistical finding and expanding it over a period of 40 years or so that it was not projected to go to. So I'm not going to touch on that topic in this episode, but I would say that fish stocks are definitely an issue and something that needs to be kind of parallel focused with the rise of plant-based as a way to kind of counteract that issue. So yeah, those are kind of some of the topics in terms of the problem with the way we catch fish now. There's also kind of environmental habitat concerns as well. The use of trawling and seafloor, not dredging necessarily, it's not the right word for it, but the trawling of dragging nets across the seafloor bottom. And there's been really big improvements there. The use of otter nets, I believe they're called, or otter trawls, as opposed to massive, an otter trawl being a less environmentally intensive way to trawl the seafloor bottom that only requires, I believe, 3 to 7 years of recuperation, as opposed to the more, let's say, damaging trawls that are of the past but are still being used today, which necessitate decades of repair. And again, there's some controversy around that too, but generally speaking, the trawling is also an issue. So the need for sustainable fishing practices also kind of necessitates the idea of using algae and plant-based protein and plant-based seafood to really kind of get it off the ground and get it moving and get consumers interested. So with the problem now defined, we're going to move on to the solutions. So algae, kind of why? What are the environmental benefits? What are the nutritional benefits? Kind of what are we talking here in terms of its offerings and place in this role or place in this industry? So microalgae specifically, but I would say algae generally, the ones that have been kind of isolated and determined for human consumption, have a dramatically lower environmental footprint and rate of damage per ton of protein produced compared to beef and soy. Beef, it's the comparison between algae and beefs is hundreds times lower in terms of, land use, CO2 emissions, and water consumption. Compared to soy, it's somewhere between half to 10% or to half to 100% reduction in a lot of these, sometimes 300% actually as well. In terms of land use, CO2 emissions, and water consumption. One of the great benefits of algae is that it kind of just recycles water. There's not a ton of intake that goes on, and the water being used is not fresh water. So assuming it's in an ocean environment or a controlled environment that's been taken from the ocean. So a lot of benefits there. I guess expanding on that, though, there's a couple nutritional benefits that are really important to highlight, one being a very high protein content in certain strains of seaweed and algae. Algae is a better term there. We'll kind of get into the definitions next, but high fiber contents, great macro or micronutrient content with really high vitamins and amino acid contents. Many algae types offering the complete range of amino acids, which is something that plant-based proteins often struggle with. So great, not only marketing ploy there, but just a great nutritional benefit, I suppose, to incorporating the ingredient. Going on there, the use of algae production reduces CO2 and phosphorus and nitrogen in ocean ecosystems and generally. And again, this speaks to kind of a very interesting role that algae plays in the larger ecosystem. There's studies that kind of recommend or that kind of promote the idea that it creates 70% of all oxygen on Earth. Algae, I guess ecosystems. They're not ecosystems, but algae. Let's just say. And I'm not entirely sure of the merit behind that, but that was a number that kept popping up very frequently. What is true, though, is that it does reduce CO2 levels, phosphorus, and nitrogen, which are very harmful and very damaging to waterways and ecosystems, including not only the flora, but the fauna, and also just the water acidity and health generally of the oceans. So kind of moving on from that, there's also kind of another use in terms of its use as an ingredient. This is where we're going to kind of start diving in more into the food section. So the use of algae as ingredients satisfy not only those taste issues that we were talking earlier, they have that kind of natural seafood occurring taste and smell and aroma, and kind of blending of those three. We talked earlier in the B2Bization of plant-based protein, how important smell is actually to taste. You get most of the taste out of things from smelling it, actually, and kind of the blend of the word is escaping me now, but kind of that blend of taste buds and oral factor, I believe, is the correct term, and then kind of the aromas that enter the nose. How important the nose is. So there's been a lot of studies on that we're going to get to, but additional offerings kind of within the algae space is a binding agent. This is kind of the most widely used application, I would say, today, really focusing in on the idea of being able to use algae as a way to bind plant-based ingredients, but also potentially 3D printed cultured cuts or not 3D printed cultured cuts, but 3D printed plant-based cuts, and then cultured seafood together using this binding agent. And a binding agent really is kind of like a meat glue in a way. It's more sophisticated than that, but the idea of being able to create whole cuts moving forward from that, additional offerings really focus on the nutritional content. So again, increased protein content is a huge one. Some variations of algae really have very impressive protein content, and being measured in terms of protein by weight as exceptional in their protein by weight, and vastly outperforming things like soy without the need of monoculture. This is something that I actually want to bring up now, though, is that the comparison between soy and algae really need to be taken carefully, because the kind of way that alternative proteins and plant-based focus have been propagated, and the idea that soy is kind of this catch-all nutritional benefit ingredient is kind of harmful, because a lot of the soy production comes from kind of clear cutting and monoculture, neither of which are beneficial in terms of long-term environmental health and sustainability. So the really important idea to take away from this is that the solution of microalgae is really only possible and productive if you learn from the prior mistakes of monoculture. We don't know what widespread ocean farming looks like yet, in terms of fish farms or algae. So it needs to really be taken very slowly and understood really thoroughly by science before we go kind of headfirst into something that could really be environmentally destructive, disrupt ecosystems, and potentially cause a lot of damage, because a lot of ecosystems, especially in places with very quick urban expansion historically and presently, think as a great example and a localized one for me, the Monterey Bay ecosystem that was expanded very rapidly. California sea otters were hunted to extinction, and then all of these kind of cascading environmental effects kind of came into being, one of which being the kind of explosion of the sea urchin population, not entirely tied just to the decline of sea otter population, but the kind of issue of sea urchin rise also gave way to kind of a decline in kelp, sea kelp. I believe it's California sea kelp or California giant sea kelp is the actual genus in question, but a very productive kelp forest ecosystem has been lost, maybe not entirely, but definitely due to human intervention and rapid urbanization and expansion. So definitely something to keep in mind and something to consider, the kind of potential issues associated with monoculture. So moving on now, going to really start diving down into the definitions here that we're dealing with in terms of algae, and really trying to make delineations between what we're discussing and kind of what we're thinking about as algae versus seaweed versus microalgae versus cyanobacteria. And finally, kind of a couple terms around taste. Just as a preface, though, really not going to be diving too much into the production processes, as this is more of an ingredients focus. And in all honesty, the technology still around harvesting is somewhat limited, and I wouldn't say primitive is the word, but hasn't really changed much from, I would say, traditional ways of harvesting algae or other species of agriculturally productive materials. So as we dive now into the definitions. Moving forward now, the term algae is really going to set off a preliminary definition for us and something to be explored, and I'm going to do my absolute best not to use things interchangeably here and really stick to the definition set out now. But just a forewarning, I'm not a ocean biologist or a marine biologist, I guess is the better term, or a nutritional scientist, but kind of, again, trying to work within my current role as an environmental technology researcher to bring out and proliferate some really what I consider to be substantial improvements in the value chain surrounding food ingredients. So starting off initially, the term algae refers to a group of organisms defined by ecological traits. Algae are usually photosynthetic, meaning that they can convert light from the sun into chemical energy, carbohydrates like sugar and starch, and that's kind of their food systems. Algae are aquatic and can be found almost anywhere that there is water and sunlight. They occur in a wide range of sizes. Some are singular cells, while others are giant kelp, kind of the California giant kelp forest we described earlier, which span for miles. And a single organism here can be 45 meters long. The algae subgrouping also includes seaweed, diatoms, turning Italian there, flagellates. That was tough. Phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, and many more photosynthetic organisms. So other than that dino one, not too bad so far in terms of the taxonomy. A couple things to note here. One being just the entire breadth of what is considered algae. So at a kind of broad consumer level, there's a misunderstanding oftentimes of what algae means. So being able to understand that not only does algae mean that pond scum that is disgusting and revolting and oftentimes dangerous for consumption, but also including historically consumed foods and really valuable resources and things that are considered, cultural significant foods and delicacies in many parts of the world, like seaweeds. So really trying to understand that algae as a term is much broader than we give it credit for, oftentimes, and at least America, but I assume in the rest of the world, and at least in another couple parts. So another couple things to note, there's very little research that's gone into documenting the taxonomy of algae. Part of this is just because of understanding kind of the flora and fauna in the ocean ecosystems is so difficult, especially as you kind of get out into the deep ocean, not only in terms of depth, but also like proximity from land. The further you go, the harder it is to kind of establish and have functioning research facilities. And this is a very interesting statistic I found that kind of showcases this and the uncertainty behind a lot of what we understand to be algae. The current scientific debate is that there are between 30,000 and 1 million total species of algae, all those being unique and separate. But when you kind of break that down further and consider the idea that we have really no idea how many species there are, that would be, if there's 30,000 understood species of algae, that's a massive jump to, 1 million species. So really understanding that the scientific exploration here is very limited so far, and that in two ways kind of proposes a couple things. It inspires hope that there's going to be so much more kind of encountered and developed as we go on. But also it's a bit scary that there's such a lack of scientific clarity in a way, that we know so little. But again, that could also be considered exciting in many of the same ways. So moving on now from that, and really focusing on the ideas behind the subdelineations, we can kind of go ahead and define some of the kind of factors that we just discussed in terms of what algae is. So seaweed is large, not microscopic organisms in the ocean. Again, these are the multicellular species that we've discussed. And there's, a couple main delineations. I would say the primary ones for our case studies are between brown, green, and red seaweeds. And even though these are color delineations, they're not entirely accurate just in terms of visual. But those are kind of the subdelineations that I've run into and understand to be kind of helpful in understanding the seaweed market generally. Moving on from that, you have microalgae, which are single cell or small number of cell organisms within the algae category. These are probably going to be the focus of most of the rest of this investigation. Seaweed is really understood to be what we generally understand seaweed to be. It's a pretty clear-cut understanding. Includes, like nori or traditional like sushi wrappings, the kind of flake that we use, I believe bonita, or maybe it's not bonita flake, but the seaweed-based flake, seasonings, that type thing, dried and distributed in a commercial setting. Microalgae is a couple great examples are spirulina, which I had mentioned earlier, something I actually consumed today, and chlorella, spelled CHLORELLA. Both of which are incredibly nutritionally dense, have great protein offerings and micronutritional benefits, used mainly as supplements or ingredients, but mainly supplements. Spirulina actually has a beautiful blue color to it. that is really vibrant and appealing for somebody who loves all things blue, especially food, which oftentimes just means candy. The blue flavor is always the best, as research will always show. But yeah, so understanding microalgae as single cell or multicellular organisms that have usually very, very, very high content nutritional benefit. Seaweed is more of a naturally occurring element. Microalgae is usually kind of has to be formed in some type of controlled laboratory setting. Cyanobacteria is a bacteria category that are aquatic and photosynthetic. They are single cell and grow in colonies. And kind of an interesting historical tidbit here, one of the first historical organisms to come to being on Earth, dated to around 3.5 billion years old. And also kind of substantive, they, I believe, currently still hold the record for the oldest fossil records that we have. So very cool. There's kind of a focus here. Not all of these or most of these, actually, I would say cyanobacteria are not meant for consumption by pretty much anyone. I'm sure somebody can eat them, and it's not a human or fish. Well, fish is not the right word, but human or livestock consumption. But cyanobacteria is potentially exceptionally harmful. It's really about trying to isolate and find specific strains here that contain rich nutritional profiles and then refining that. So again, making an emphatic statement here that these are ingredients to be processed, not to be eaten raw. Disclaimer I hope I wouldn't have had to make, but on we go. And the final kind of thing we're going to touch on here is the idea of umami and the science behind it. So umami is the taste profile and the taste on the tongue specifically, not a sensory, a smell, but the taste on the tongue that is associated with monosodium glutamate, which also goes by the name of MSG. So kind of an interesting idea there. The idea being it's the salty kind of rich kind of encompassing flavor that really is very impactful and kind of takes over a lot of your senses when you eat a food closely associated with it. And it's very prevalent in a lot of seafood. So understanding the umami category is very important, and then understanding what I'm going to be referring to as kind of that seafoody taste and smell and aroma. The two have to play in very close proximity. And now that we move into the solutions category, I'm going to put up an image that's going to run for most of this, in which I'm going to go ahead and look at a lot of the images or a lot of the kind of umami ratings of some of these strains or species of seaweed that we're going to discuss, and algae, I guess, more specifically, or reverse those, algae more generally, seaweed more specifically, and trying to isolate and identify what's going to be helpful for what. So this is going to be the more technical breakdown, looking at specific kind of chemistries and makeups that kind of benefit various parts of ingredient use of seaweed. So I'm going to get a lot of these names wrong, I can guarantee that, but I'm going to go ahead and get started. So Rhodomonas salina, I'm going to be breaking down these categories by function and application. So the function is a very high umami taste with minimal off notes. When I say off notes here, this is going to be referring to floral notes, rancid notes, grassy notes, and earthy notes. And all of these are applications to, not the off notes, but all of these discussions are going to be in terms of applications to plant-based seafood. So one more time, Rhodomonas salina. This is going to be the third from the left bar we have, focused on about an umami score of 4-ish on average. And the umami score is going to kind of rank in terms of, I guess, just prevalence, but going to be moving kind of left to right and tracking the prevalence of it. You have the general line, the dotted line that is referring to the gradual increase as the log increases. I wouldn't worry so much about the x-axis, that being the log. It's kind of just an indication of kind of variability, but also just general collection data. So I would really focus on where the black dot, the center dot falls, and also kind of a little bit of the variability, because a lot of these haven't been really exposed to commercial expansion and kind of what that means. So there is some variability in terms of their reflected nutritional profiles. But so Rhodomonas salina, that high umami taste with minimal off notes. The lack of off notes really make it a very usable product, and it has a high correlation of taste to mussels and some other shellfish. So what this actually, crab being a great example, what this means in terms of its application, that's its function. Its application means that it is an exceptional category or exceptional candidate to be used in crab-based formulations. And we're going to touch on a couple companies who have explored this later on, but crab is incredibly hard to replicate because of its really lack of present off notes and its particularly strong sense of umami and specific fish flavor, not overwhelming fish flavor and not general fish flavor, but it's specific fish flavor. So it's very interesting to find a category here, or a species here, Rhodomonas salina, which has that direct application we're working with. So moving on from that one, now touching on Tetraselmis chewy. This is kind of its functional area, kind of more of a chemistry breakdown. It has a really interesting presence of alcohol and ketones that are very similar to several seafood profiles, and also a lot of aromas that are very similar to a wide variety of seafood profiles. So this is a great candidate for kind of a pretty broad application in the seafood manufacturing or plant-based seafood manufacturing space. This is partially due to the free amino acids, the focus on glutamic acid, alanine, and arginine, that kind of compose a lot of the similar chemistry profiles to those fish that we're talking about. I would say the main applications here for plant-based are for plant-based mimics of mussels and prawns. Mussels is going to be a pretty frequent reflection point. Of all of them, I would say mussels, prawn / shrimp are going to be the most frequently revisited categories, as well as just fish generally. That wide application of fish categories, just generally dealing with a white meat-based fish. But specifically, tetra, this is Tetraselmis, Tetraselmis chewy, ranking in terms of its umami score as actually the second highest, is very impressive, and really does have a very specific depth of seafood taste that really does bode well for that mussel comparison. Moving now on here, Phytodactyl tricornutum. This is just going to get more embarrassing as we go. This is a very interesting one, ranks as the highest umami taste profile of the analyzed batch, let's say, that being, let's see here, 8 categories or 8 species. The function speaks to a very high umami taste profile that's represented in this graph, and a very, very strong seafood smell to go with that. Again, great correlation with mussels. I think the really important thing to note is that the further right you go on this kind of graph, the more you kind of run into things that have a depth of seafood taste kind of associated with those kind of filter organisms like mussels, and away from the more, I wouldn't say gamey fish, that's not the right word, but kind of, let's say hunted organisms that kind of are more free-moving, hunt on their own, not necessarily a filter organism. I think a crab is a great example of that. It doesn't have necessarily a strong seafood taste, but has a very strong and identifiable taste. It is partially correlated with a fishy taste, partially correlated with that kind of smell, but mainly correlated with umami. So Phytodactyl tricornutum is a great example here because it melds the high umami content with the high seafood smell and taste to really replicate. And despite having now 3 mussel-based candidates, that is one of the hardest foods to replicate is mussels. So bear that in mind. There's beyond that though, there's a really great applicability to shellfish generally, and used in certain dosages and removed for and refined through a lot of kind of processes to remove the off notes. It can also be applied to fish generally. Kind of a benefit here is that you could potentially use it in a lower quantity and achieve a lot greater result than having to include maybe one of the ingredients on the left here, desalina and Oceana being great examples. Lower umami scores with a need for then a higher quantity incorporated. So kind of a balance here. And then the idea probably being generally for a manufacturer to get access to all 8 of these and find the best one for them. But each one does have their own similar, or each one has their own distinct quality. So important to note. But again, Phaedodactyl tricornutum, best application probably mussel and other shellfish groups, but kind of getting now into a general application within fish generally, and the production of, say, things like a whitefish generally, that you can kind of just slot in without too much specification and too many limits. Next category we're going to talk about now is Nanochroropis, that being Nanochroropis, so Nanochroropis, something like that, man. Oceanica. So, and Oceanica, we're going to call it. Function, really focusing on incredibly close aroma profile to shrimp. Also produces a water byproduct that is very similar in smell and taste to that shrimp category. So not only do you get a raw ingredient to be harvested and utilized as a shrimp additive or a shrimp mimic, but you also get a water byproduct that can kind of also be used in a similar manner, and something that's very low cost to also incorporate. The main rationale here is due to the aldehydes present in the Oceanica species, this chemical compound, just specific to it, that is very similar to that in shrimp, and kind of gives it that taste. So the best application here, and one that's already ongoing commercially, is going to be a direct application to plant-based shrimp. There are going to need to be some pretty significant reductions in terms of off notes, though. This is one to kind of note. All of them have certain off notes of varying kind of depth and presence, but Oceanica is one that needs to have some further refinement or potentially genetic engineering. I'm very big on that in terms of the ingredient space, but something to really be considered and talked through, I guess, as we go through this, is the presence of off notes in all of these, but a direct focus, because shrimp is especially frozen shrimp, which is where a lot of the direction is heading for plant-based. It's a very inoffensive, let's say, category in terms of off notes. The offensiveness usually comes from texture, maybe speaking from personal dislike of shrimp here, but there's not really a ton of off notes in terms of that seafoody taste or other kind of, rancidness or grassiness or whatever. Moving on now, we're actually going to deviate slightly in the next 3 that we discuss, actually, technically, and focus now on spirulina and chlorella that aren't represented on the graph, and we're just going to take a little detour here and really talk about the function of these two. Both are very similar. They have different specifics in terms of their micronutrients, but both offer up a very specific function in terms of ingredients and supplementation, which is supplementations where they found most of their success so far, but functioning mainly for increased protein content, micronutrients, fibers, and antioxidants. Most present applications so far, again, have been additives to plant-based formulations because of their lack of significant off notes, as well as individual retail as a supplement, either in like pill form or powder form, or blended into things, again, as kind of like a smoothie ingredient you can think of. Then spirulina smoothies are fantastic, let me say. I think I had my first one in like 2018, actually. So it's been around for a while. But you can kind of think, if you've seen the B2Bization of plant-based protein episode, you can kind of think of these as kind of comparable to chickpea in their kind of industry fit, not in terms of their growth so far or in terms of their widespreadness, if that's a word, but kind of the idea that chickpea is a very inoffensive plant and crop that can be very rapidly blended into formulations of things. And spirulina has found some great success filling that category as well. So yeah, moving now into what is going to be called Galderia, kind of bringing out a little accent there, but that is Galdieria. Again, another supplement mainly, or ingredient additive focused on increased protein content. There's significant movement here, I would say, specifically on bioengineering on this ingredient specifically, because it is an additive. It's not meant for direct consumption. A good example of a company working in this space and on this specific product is Algae, that being Algreen. But again, another one that is very comparable to chickpea and doesn't necessarily warrant its own consumption in an isolate, but much more so as an incorporation into formulations for plant-based seafood. Or plant-based generally, not just seafood, but yeah. So the final two representations on the graph are going to be U. rigida or Ulva rigida, that being rigida, R-I-G-I-D-A. Here we come into a very interesting kind of part of this discussion where texture becomes a more important area. Something U. rigida is very equipped to do is add a fish-like texture. It's mainly used right now as a blending ingredient in extrusion and then reforming. But if it has, this textural ability, it's going to be very useful in 3D printing as well as electrostatic spinning. Two areas that have kind of been of issue for plant-based innovators. In addition, very high protein content in terms of weight, good nutritional value, and a very high seafood taste profile. It doesn't necessarily rank at the top of the list in terms of its application in umami, but it's a pretty productive factor there. It definitely has more of an industry application as an ingredient than it does necessarily as a taste-based ingredient. But it does offer a seafood taste that is pretty hard to match, I would say, in a texture perspective. I would say the main benefit, though, comes from texture, from the reading I've done. Again, this is a very high-level market analysis, not necessarily something that's granular in terms of the time spent on any specific one of these, either just the 8 to 10 or 11 specific species of algae, or I guess greater subcategories that I've found and wanted to identify. So moving on to a final one here, and this is going to be kind of a final representation, I guess, on the ingredient side, focused on Saccharina latissimi, that being Saccharina latissimi. So what we have here is a pretty aroma-focused ingredient, I would say. You're going to really have this one really impact the olfactory receptors, I believe, focused on smell, if that's the correct term, not necessarily taste, but it's going to feel a bit more of the fishy taste because a lot of the concentration is in that kind of nose area and the smells. What you mainly use this here for as an additive is for the plant-based fish species that have that more fishy taste but don't necessarily have a need for a dual role of umami. So where this might have some benefit over some of the first areas we covered, such as P. tricornutum, is that P. tricornutum has a very high umami score on this graph, but does not really have the same texture benefits or aromas in terms of fish without that umami score. So it really just comes down to a formulation perspective, what you need, what you don't need. And again, the idea here being that offering up all of these as examples and really just showing and showcasing the breadth of ingredients on offer. So that was a pretty high level analysis and I guess showcase in a way of kind of what we're dealing with here on an ingredients level and kind of what the options have been discovered so far. And these are just some of the focuses of research in the last couple years. Most of the scientific work, the graph especially that came out on these species originates in about 2022, so you can probably look at the research there coming from 2019 to 2022 would be my guess. So already have been about, somewhere between a year to a year and a half of ability for growth in this space, but I think at a high level, this is kind of what we're dealing with in terms of some of our ingredients outlooks. So the next couple sections are going to explore the commercial outlooks here, and we're going to start right now with the commercial outlook on a startup level, which I subcategorized out to go ahead and go through some of the companies doing interesting work and kind of where they're exploring, and delineated that out by ingredients, commercialized production methods, and then commercialized foods, so foods that have gone straight to consumer already or have found success in producing a product. So at ingredients level, we're going to start off with C6 Energy, who actually have found most of their success in creating biomass content for fuel production using algae, something that I hope to explore in a later episode. But they've been able to produce a food binding agent as an ingredient through their research. Very interesting, and something that, again, speaks to a lot of the strains that we discovered. Moving from there, back of the yards, Spireat, that being Spireat, Ocean Orchards, and Energaia, that being Energaia, have all really made great progress in spirulina production, mainly with extending its shelf life and reducing its off notes. So again, another great innovation in terms of kind of pushing it into the ingredient space, being able to, take a cyanobacteria and really elevate it to a level where it's usable in a lot of commercial settings. Back of the Yards is also using spirulina as extract for heme, and I hope to spend another ingredients arms race episode just focusing on heme specifically. But heme, generally, you can take it as a ingredient that has been mainly commercialized by, I would say, I believe it's Beyond Meat. It kind of gives it that bleedy appearance and taste, and texture and smell in plant-based meats. That's kind of what heme does. When you think of the patties that, when you put them on a grill and they kind of have that bubbling of it's not blood, but it does look like blood. It's actually a protein, I believe, that's released as water kind of seeps out of various elements of the meat. So that's kind of the protein content there, and the exact ingredient in question. And spirulina is able to be extracted for that too. So very interesting. Moving on, we have the example of Green Sea, who produce multiple strains of algae, one including, again, might butcher this one, but Ascophyllum nodosum, that being Ascophyllum nodosum, and Chlorella vulgaris for high protein and nutritional content additives. Kind of an interesting, I guess, tangent would be that these are also directly applicable in the animal feed additive space. That's another great application of algae generally as used as an animal feed, and varying research going on to kind of explore the benefits of that beyond just the high protein content, but maybe being able to expand it into methane reductions and things like that. So very interesting, and something to continue exploring. Moving on from that, still in the ingredient space, touching on Algama, who have a full R&D suite. That's kind of their main focus is R&D on the algae space, with 200 plus prototypes in commercial and regulatory development. So think of these guys as somebody almost like a pharma company who practice really extensive R&D in hopes of commercializing, patenting, owning, and distributing really specific strains of algae. Moving on from them, the last couple bunch here are just operating in an interesting space, especially in the ingredient space. They're kind of focused and lasered in on a couple or one strains of algae, that including Oregon seaweed, Sophie's bionutrients, Provectus algae, and Oceanium, all working to develop and commercialize their own forms. You can kind of think of them as smaller versions of Algama, or algama, depending on how you pronounce it. Now moving on to the commercialized production, I think that this is probably a very high growth area, but not necessarily one that's experienced a lot of standout development, just because it's very unclear where this section of the industry is heading. But going to go ahead and explore this. The first one being Xanthella, that being Xanthella. Main product here being photobioreactors to produce microalgae and cyanobacteria. Really trying to focus and laser in away from the kelp and seaweed area and more so in the lab-grown algae space. Probably trying to really laser in on a couple areas here, but a lot of these companies are going to focus on kind of bespoke, or that being specifically, what would the term be? Demanded protein contents, or not protein contents, algae strains. So they kind of operate in that space and creating those photobioreactors for direct sale to others. Another 2 or 3 here being Breville, and they really are focused here on the bespoke microalgae. They're not selling their photobioreactors or their reactors to anyone else. They're strictly creating them and using them in-house for the pre-production of ingredients that you can subcontract them out for. 2 other interesting companies working in this space are Seagrass and Pure Algae, working to develop kind of commercialized production either of components or the ingredients themselves. Last area to touch on here in terms of the innovators include the commercialized foods. So really going to focus on the people who have found success in incorporating algae already in specific plant-based offerings. So Seed to Surf, I would say, is probably the most interesting example to me. They've been able to incorporate knob kelp and konbu into an enoki mushroom mimic of crab and a celery mimic of whitefish, respectively, and found pretty great success. They've been pretty critically acclaimed, both in terms of their taste and also just publicly. So interesting one to track there. New Wave Foods, who's somewhat of a new player on the scene, but making really substantive progress. They use seaweed as an ingredient in their shrimp products, have done so for quite a while. Shrimp being really their only category right now, but have a couple other projects in research and development at the moment that also use seaweed. Mimic Seafood uses algae in several of their plant-based fish products with a focus on its use as a binding agent as well as a taste kind of factor, really achieving that seafoody umami taste. The last couple here, Quelp, that being Queelp, produce full algae-based burgers with some other ingredients as well, but main focus on algae. They received a lot of attention for that and have been not super outlandish or super innovative in anything outside so far, but that itself took years of development, I'm sure, and is very impressive and a great step forward. Moving on from them, Umaro, this is probably my favorite one here, a seaweed and chickpea-based bacon. Again, touches on the idea that there are applications beyond seafood to algae, and I touched earlier on the idea that pork and seafood actually share a lot of the similar categories in terms of its need for an umami content or a high umami content ingredient. So a direct application here. Umaro also offers some seafood offerings with seaweed. And then the last thing I'll point to here is plant ruption, that being the word plant with an added ruption. Also make a seaweed burger. Very interesting. Not entirely ununique from Quelp, but kind of their own spin on it. And I believe actually specifically focus on seaweed, not algae generally. So slight differentiation. Getting now into this, before we touch on the conclusions, we're going to talk about hurdles to development and policy. And starting first with the hurdles, I believe it's important to touch on that while algae is this 3.5 billion year old ingredient, scaling has not been easy. It's been limited in terms of maturity and an understanding of the materials harvested. A great quote from a researcher on kind of the applications of algae and the commercialization of it have, in the biofuel space specifically, but I think this speaks to kind of the larger trend of algae, is that the commercialization of algae has been hindered by relatively low yield and high harvesting cost. Again, not entirely unexpected, seeing as it's probably very high water content and production of it is not necessarily easy to access at the moment. The limited light penetration and poor cultivation dynamics in natural settings can both contribute to the low yield. Again, so more research is really needed to determine maximum potential in terms of its growing environment and how to really maximize that and then extract maximal value, whether this is through genetic engineering or just continued research and understanding of how algae can really play a role and perhaps thrive outside its natural environment in the seas or elsewhere. Continuing on that, there are some kind of indications and areas of growth and benefits, though. One being an increased demand for improved plant-based ingredients in Europe, as I touched on in the plant-based B2B episode, is really stimulating production in areas with high potential seaweed and algae growth generally. So great example being Norway, Denmark, and Ireland, all of whom have rapidly expanded their output of these products and really grown a commercial sector that was previously non-existent. Non-existent is a hell of a word. Non-existent. There's also a rapid movement from accelerators getting into this space as they see it as potentially a very high environmental play, being able to take advantage of certain carbon reduction requirements and benefits. A great example here in terms of an accelerator's Blue Bio Value, really doing some great work. And also Hatch has a couple accelerator programs directly targeting not necessarily seafood or algae, but kind of operating in this space. So kind of moving on from that, I've already kind of touched on the potential for genetic engineering and isolates as a way to move past off notes and really focus on the ingredient space, but thought it'd be fair to the very practical applications of powderized versions and incorporating these ingredients into extrusion technologies, but also spinning and 3D printing, as I covered in the plant-based protein B2Bization video. I'm pretty high on those as potentially transformative in terms of the product offerings and representing pretty significant strides in expanding those offerings, but also expanding kind of the quality that's being provided to consumers. There's certain challenges kind of present in incorporating these, especially the elimination of off notes, but when you can boil them down to isolates without those off notes and really focus on the protein content and possible either umami or seafood taste, really being able to use them in formulations and emphasis here on powderized versions of these goods. Again, mainly in extrusion, 3D printing, and spinning to improve kind of the content of those formulations. Now, kind of moving on, here's the last kind of substantive topic area we're going to cover is really the policy before we move on to our conclusions. So at a very high level, I would say policy support is somewhat limited, not necessarily non-existent, but certainly limited. So, but that said, there's a couple great examples, but I think where you're going to find more policy support is in the algae for biofuels. And there's some runoff here, but I think that's kind of more of the mainstream funding from public support. Regardless, though, we're going to go ahead and touch on, I think, the most prominent example of algae and plant-based food funding. That's $2.7 million from the EU fund Seafood Alternative. That's ALG-Ternative. This comes from the EU Maritime and Fisheries Fund. Again, $2.7 million with a focus on applying algae and plant-based seafood. I think this came a couple months ago, but had been in talks for around a year and a half. So good to finally see it come through. In addition to that, you have $40 million in funding from the U.S. Department of Energy on algae as a CO2 sequestration tool. This went to, again, a lot of biofuel companies, but to a couple food providers too, and ingredient providers. Good example, I'll now go through some of the project lists. Good example being $2 million in DOE funding going towards the carbon capture and utilization for protein and fatty acids. This went to Global Algae Innovations in San Diego, focused on developing technology suite, lowering production costs, making algae products in the food, chemical, polymer, and animal feed markets, and really finding ways to industrialize and scale those. Another great example being at Helios NRG in Amherst, New York, with the idea of planning new algae technology, being able to capture CO2 and convert it into valuable byproducts with a focus on pharmaceuticals and food. DOE funding here was just under $2 billion, actually about 700 and what is that, $72 short of $2 million. Interesting. But yeah, that's again, focus on mainly the CO2 sequestration abilities, and then I think at an even higher level, focus on the use of algae as a biofuel, which is not entirely unrelated to the E-Jet video or the SAF video we put out, Sustainable Aviation Fuel video we put out. And biofuels are very valuable in that space. So, especially in the transition, hopefully, to E-Jet. A kind of final point here is less on the funding, more on the programs side, but the New Zealand-Singapore bilateral research program on future food funds went ahead and funded research on plant-based alternative proteins with a focus on algae incorporation, including seaweed, and finding ways to incorporate those into precision fermentation and eventually end products to be released at a commercial level. So again, it's not all about just funding companies. Oftentimes, as I said for the plant-based protein video, a lot of it goes towards like university research centers and establishing protein innovation centers. That's a very interesting term, the PIC term, that has been really widespread, I think, in Canada, the US, the UK, Singapore, parts of Asia, Australia. Protein innovation centers are very useful, and they bring together really great minds to form kind of bilateral or multilateral, I guess is the better term, focuses ranging from university level to commercial level and retailers and such, the ingredients level as well as farmers. It's very interesting collaboration of people. So really looking to sum all this now, there's 5 or 6 points to really make that I think are all really valuable, and kind of summing this and capping this off. Primary one being that the ingredients market is going to be the most valuable and lucrative here, and being able to distribute these products at the larger plant-based cycle and also cultivated. It has some applications, as I said, for binding, but functioning as an ingredient first is really where algae should be heading in terms of its applications to food, just because of how diverse it is, and the diversity within algae offerings really does provide it a great opportunity to really factor into an enormous amount of food streams and production processes and manufacturing streams, and really potentially eliminate the need for competition for any just one particular strain, and really open up a lot of innovation through genetic engineering or plant breeding to create really interesting and compelling arguments for expanded manufacturing of algae. Already it has such benefits in micronutrient content and protein content, let alone its ability to sequester carbon and phosphorus and all the other harmful elements we were talking about earlier. But kind of moving on from that, there's a really large market segment available for algae in the supplement industry. I think you've seen some great movement there from Spirulina and Chlorella. Very successful companies in that space. I mentioned a couple earlier. Nutritional beverages, especially, I think you're seeing that as a very solidified, no longer fad, those protein shake kind of companies, but a great area of expansion for potentially a company moving out of the B2B ingredient space into more of a retail space, although I do still believe the B2B space for ingredients is the way to go. And B2B generally for most of plant-based manufacturing is still very valuable and very lucrative and very significant in terms of building out a higher level of synergy and general integration within the market, just in terms of its technology standpoint, trying to expedite technologies at a more wide rate than necessarily a vertical rate. You kind of, again, comparing that to extrusion. Extrusion no longer is necessarily seen as the market future. It's seen as a part of the future. So not betting it all in one specific category is kind of just the thing to do here, but really hoping that there is a wide integration for algae. So I think a big part of this is trying to work with manufacturing companies. So really looking at cultivated meat, looking at kind of their needs for layering, but also looking at spinning companies and their needs for high protein content, but also minimal taste components, but also looking at the potential benefits that that algae proposes as in terms of taste, those really strong seafood tastes, and being able to really factor those in and use those. That's going to be incumbent on manufacturers, but something to posit as a challenge almost too is not looking outside of plants, or not looking outside of algae for that seafood taste, not using additives, not using or chemical additives that we don't know the name of, xanthan gums and things like that, even though that's not a seafood taste, but the alphanumeric parts of food labels, really trying to focus in on naturally occurring ingredients, and doing so with kelp and algae and cyanobacteria, whatever. Moving on from that, more on the production side of things, the modular bioreactors have received some attention from investors, but ideal growing conditions and settings are yet to be determined and are going to remain most likely in ocean environments for the near future. Modular reactors and grow sites are more so on the R&D side, especially with the use and now proliferation of certain cyanobacteria as supplements and ingredients. Really trying to incorporate, I think, a modular reactor in terms of a kelp grow site or a general seaweed grow site is a bit short-sighted. There are examples where it's worked. There's actually one in Sacramento, funnily enough. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but I think still the best conditions for grow sites. And also, when you think about it, potentially the best conditions for exports in terms of transportation costs are still going to be concentrated along the coasts. Finally, now getting into the last couple points here. The high potential applications in the seafood space is going to lead to really exponential growth in that market. So seafood has notoriously been very poor performing, poor tasting, and poor quality compared to the rest of plant-based. I think there's arguments made that this is due to concentration first on beef products, since beef is a higher emitter of greenhouse gases and environmental degradation kind of metrics and statistics than seafood is. But I think you could also make the argument that there's a greater risk of depleting and exterminating a lot of types of fish than there is, cattle. So people are kind of starting to tier it now in terms of a focus and really starting to pay some attention to seafood. And I think a really great way to expand on that increased commercial interest and consumer interest is with a massive betterment in its quality. And I think you can get that through some of the texture, some of the taste, some of the smell benefits from seaweed incorporation and algae incorporation generally into plant-based seafood, and really trying to target that APAC market, being a huge consumer of fish products, but just globally as well. Really trying to capitalize on this kind of new market moment, kind of a demographic shift in a way. It's a term from public health I haven't used in a while, but demographic dividend kind of. But when you think of a demographic, really think of it in terms of a rising consumer demographic who's really looking now for plant-based options that are low price, high quality. So being able to incorporate a potentially very low cost product like an algae, if you can get the growing conditions right, with a very high quality ingredient that comes from it, has potential to massively reduce manufacturing costs, ingredient sorting costs, etc. And ingredients do usually pose around 20% of all 20% of all plant-based meat costs. So great way to kind of lower those. I'd say generally in this, you're seeing mainly a participation for plant-based shrimp, partially because you don't need a ton of the specific umami or seafood notes in shrimp, but the presence of off notes can be damning. So you're seeing kind of a more conservative approach using more conservative taste profiles from seaweed and algae generally in that plant-based shrimp. And you're seeing a lot of investment here, as well as consumer and retail interest and engagement. I'd probably guess the next area of exploration in this category would be shellfish. Somebody's going to make a pretty bold leap here and try to go for the mussel play would be my guess, since there is such really great research now indicating that there are some algae strains that are directly applicable there in terms of the mussel, but I also think crab. We've already seen, as I said earlier, some really interesting products come out with enoki mushroom and algae mixtures and producing a crab mimicry product. So I think there's a lot of potential here. But I would also say it's a very far cry from where the industry needs to be in terms of its development and maturity. And I think with all the promise that algae poses, it has its own significant barriers and hurdles to overcome, especially when you start regarding the manufacturing costs and the conditions still haven't been optimized. But at an ingredient level and solving the long burden question of achieving a good tasting plant-based seafood. I think there's a lot to be excited about, and a lot that you can really claim that the industry is well on its way to becoming a staple in, first the frozen food aisle of plant-based products before really achieving a pretty large market share across retail spaces and beyond, and food service, etc. So, hope you all enjoyed that deep dive on algae and its role in the plant-based meat economy, and episode 1 in the ingredients arms race. Something I hope to keep going here on, and kind of give you an insight on some of the next couple, looking at heme as a manufacturing ingredient, and kind of maybe some of the legal questions around that. But yeah, heme will probably be the next one, and beyond that, really looking at some of the other chemical compounds or unexpected ingredients, maybe some of the ancient grains, etc., that are really coming into being and positing interesting questions, chickpea, etc., in the manufacturing industry. So yeah, hope you all enjoyed that. That was the most recent episode of the A Show, that being E with an acute accent, brought to you by your host, Parker Bovée. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you on the next episode.